Before the world called it Africa, this continent was home to hundreds of powerful civilizations, each with its own science, politics, religion, and identity. Empires like Mali, the land of gold and universities; Congo, with its sophisticated diplomacy and trade networks. Ethiopia is one of the world's oldest continuous kingdoms, Great Zimbabwe, whose stone cities still defy colonial lies. Benin, home to artistry so advanced that Europeans refused to believe Africans made it. This was a continent of kings, queens, mathematicians, warriors, architects, traders, and thinkers. Then everything changed. By the late 1800s, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, a meeting where Africans were never invited, and carved Africa like a cake. In less than 20 years, Europe controlled over 90% of the entire continent. They took land, they took resources, they took people, they took culture, and they destroyed the political systems Africans had built for thousands of years. But here's the question we explore today. How did Africa finally break free? And why, despite independence, does freedom still feel incomplete even today? Because the truth is this: Africa won the political battle, but the economic war never ended. Welcome to How Africa Got Independent, the story of liberation, betrayal, sabotage, and the unfinished fight for true African freedom. To understand how Africa won its freedom, we must first understand how it was stolen. It begins in 1884, inside a cold conference hall in Berlin, Germany. 14 European powers gathered around a long wooden table: Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Spain, Italy, and others. Not a single African leader was invited. Not one African voice was heard. Yet the entire future of the African continent was about to be rewritten. This 2-month meeting, known as the Berlin Conference, was not a diplomatic gathering. It was an auction. Europe wasn't dividing empty land. They were dividing living civilizations, nations with kings, economies, laws, cultures, and identities that had existed for centuries: the empires of Mali and Ethiopia, the kingdoms of Buganda, Benin, Congo, Ashanti, the ancient city-states of the Swahili coast, all ignored, all erased with the stroke of a pen. European powers used maps, not morality; rulers, not respect; lines, not logic. They drew borders that sliced through ethnic groups, split families, and forced ancient enemies into the same artificial state. The borders we see in Africa today, almost all straight lines, were designed for one thing: European convenience, not African unity. Out of this conference came the scramble for Africa, a race of invasion and occupation. By 1900, European empires controlled over 90% of Africa, and with this occupation came brutality. Forced labor became the backbone of colonial economies. Africans were taxed on their own land, and if they couldn't pay, they were forced to work on European farms, mines, and railways. Land seizures pushed communities into crowded reserves. Identity destruction became policy. Languages banned, cultures demonized, histories rewritten. The Berlin Conference did not bring order. It brought chaos, the kind that Africa still lives with today. Border conflicts, ethnic divisions, and national instability caused by boundaries that were never meant to work. But the story doesn't end here, because while Europe thought it was dividing Africa forever, it was planting the seeds of the resistance that would later set Africa free. Africa never accepted colonization. Before African nations raised flags of independence in the 1950s and 60s, before political parties and liberation armies existed, Africans were already fighting for their land, dignity, and sovereignty. Colonization did not arrive peacefully, and it was never accepted quietly. From the very first moment Europeans tried to expand control, African societies responded with courage, strategy, and sacrifice. These early movements became the foundation of the independence wave 50 years later. 1. Ethiopia versus Italy, the Battle of Adwa, 1896, one of the most legendary victories in world history. Italy attempted to colonize Ethiopia, believing, like many European powers, that African resistance would collapse But Emperor Menelik II united millions, mobilized a vast army, and defeated Italy decisively at Adwa. This was more than a battle. It was proof to the entire world that Africans could defeat Europe militarily, and it inspired anti-colonial fighters from Ghana to South Africa for decades. 1. The 𝑒𝑚𝑎𝑔𝑔𝑖 Rebellion, Tanzania, 1905–1907. In German-occupied Tanganyika, Africans were forced to grow cotton instead of food, leading to famine and suffering. When German brutality intensified, dozens of ethnic groups united under a spiritual movement known as 𝑚𝑎𝑔𝑔𝑖. The belief was simple but powerful. The battle was righteous, and spiritual protection would give people strength. Over 250,000 Africans died during the uprising, but their unity was revolutionary. The rebellion forced Germany to rethink its rule and became a symbol of collective African resistance. 1. The Anglo-Zulu War, South Africa, 1879. Before full colonization, Britain sought to control powerful African kingdoms. One of the strongest was the Zulu nation, led by King 𝒂𝒊𝒅𝒂𝒂. The Zulu warriors stunned the world at the Battle of 𝑖𝑠𝒂𝒊𝒣, defeating a modern British army using tactics, discipline, and sheer bravery. Though the British eventually overpowered the Zulu kingdom, the war demonstrated something Europe did not expect. African nations would fight fiercely for sovereignty. Why these early movements matter. Each uprising, Ethiopia, 𝑒𝑚𝑎𝑔𝑒, the Zulu nation, and countless others, planted the seeds of future liberation. They showed Africans that colonial rule was not destiny. Unity is a weapon. Resistance is possible, even against global empires. By the early 1900s, the idea of freedom was no longer just a dream. It had already been fought for with blood, strategy, and sacrifice. The independence era simply built on foundations laid long before. This video is sponsored by Fitness Lifestyle, a Herbalife distributor dedicated to helping people manage weight and improve health. Whether you want to lose weight, build muscle, detox, clear stretch marks, pimples, acne, or regrow hair, click the link below to order now. Interested in joining Herbalife? Become a distributor to earn extra income, enjoy discounts, and help others achieve their health goals. Contact Fitness Lifestyle via the link in the description to get started. World War II was not fought on African soil alone, but it changed Africa more than many history books admit. It became the crack in the colonial system, the moment when the European empires that once seemed invincible began to fall apart. When the war broke out in 1939, European powers turned to the colonies for support. More than 1 million African soldiers were recruited. Some volunteered, many were forced, to fight in defense of Britain, France, Belgium, and other colonial rulers. Africans fought in Burma, Ethiopia, North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. They shed blood for countries that denied them basic human rights. And when the war ended, a question began to echo across the continent. Why fight for freedom abroad while we are denied freedom at home? African soldiers returned with new experiences, new world views, and most importantly, new expectations. They had seen Europeans defeated on the battlefield. They had seen ideas of white superiority crumble under the pressure of war. They had seen the hypocrisy of countries preaching democracy while practicing colonial oppression. Some soldiers returned as heroes. Many returned to racism, poverty, and second-class citizenship. These veterans became some of the earliest organizers of political parties, unions, and revolutionary movements that pushed for independence. But the war also changed Europe. After 6 years of destruction, Europe was weak, exhausted, and financially bankrupt. The great colonial empires simply no longer had the strength to control millions of people overseas. Britain was in debt, France was unstable, Belgium had been invaded, Italy had collapsed. The message was clear. The age of empires was cracking. Across Africa, people began to sense that the world had shifted, that the moment to demand freedom had finally arrived. World War II didn't give Africa independence, but it created the perfect conditions for revolution. It exposed European fragility, inspired African confidence, and ignited the political awakening that would explode in the decades that followed. It was the spark that lit the fuse of liberation. As the 1940s and 1950s unfolded, a new force began to rise across the continent, a force more powerful than colonial armies, more unifying than borders drawn in Europe, and more inspiring than any foreign ideology. That force was Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism became the political engine of African liberation. It was the idea that Africans everywhere, on the continent and in the diaspora, shared a common destiny, and that Africa could never be truly free unless its people stood together. Across the continent, visionary leaders emerged, each carrying a piece of the same dream: freedom, unity, and dignity. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana became the most electrifying voice of this movement. After studying in the US and organizing Pan-African networks in Britain, he returned home with a mission to awaken a continent. His message was simple but revolutionary: "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you." He believed political independence was the foundation on which Africa's economic and cultural rebirth would be built. In East Africa, Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika championed ujamaa, an African form of socialism rooted in community cooperation. Nyerere argued that Africans did not need to copy Europe. They already had their own systems of collective responsibility. His leadership helped unite more than 120 ethnic groups under one national identity. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, after enduring imprisonment by the British, became the face of a long struggle for land and freedom. For Kenyatta, independence wasn't just about removing the British flag. It was about returning stolen land to its rightful owners. In Central Africa, a young, charismatic leader rose who would become a symbol of African hope and the tragic cost of independence. Patrice Lumumba of the Congo stood firmly against Belgium's attempts to maintain control after independence. He demanded true sovereignty and refused to let Congo become a puppet state. His assassination, backed by foreign intelligence agencies, became one of Africa's greatest wounds, proof that freedom would not come easily. And then there was Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, a global statesman who used his voice at the League of Nations and later the United Nations to call for African unity. He pushed for the creation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, the political home of Pan-Africanism. Together, these leaders carried a powerful message: Africa must unite or remain weak. They understood that as long as African nations were divided, foreign powers would continue to manipulate economies, politics, and borders. But united, Africa could reclaim its destiny. This generation laid the ideological foundation for independence. They connected African struggles from Accra to Dar es Salaam, from Nairobi to Addis Ababa, from the Caribbean to Black America. Their speeches inspired millions, their courage shook empires. The rise of these Pan-African leaders did not just ignite nationalism, it made independence unavoidable. From the late 1940s to the 1960s, Africa entered a storm, one that Europe could no longer contain. Across the continent, ordinary Africans rise up. Students, farmers, workers, veterans, women, traditional leaders, all demanding one thing: freedom. By this time, Europe is weakened by World War II. Their economies are collapsing, and maintaining empires thousands of kilometers away is becoming impossible. But the final blow does not come from Europe's weakness. It comes from Africa's strength. Ghana leads the way in 1957. The spark begins in West Africa. Kwame Nkrumah organized boycotts, strikes, and a powerful political movement that forced Britain to retreat. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to achieve independence. This moment sends shockwaves across the African continent. It proves that colonial rule is not permanent. It can be defeated. Algeria's brutal war, 1954 to 1962. In North Africa, the fight is long and bloody. Algeria waged one of the most violent anti-colonial wars in modern history. Over 1 million Algerians died fighting French occupation, but they win. Their victory becomes a global symbol of resistance and sacrifice. Kenya, the Mau Mau Rebellion. Meanwhile, in East Africa, Kenya erupts. The Mau Mau uprising challenges British control over land and political power. Britain responds with mass arrests, detention camps and executions, but the spirit of resistance refuses to die. By 1963, Kenya became free. Congo, Lumumba versus Belgium. In Central Africa, Belgium's rule in Congo is one of the harshest in the world. Patrice Lumumba rises as the voice of the people, calling out exploitation, forced labor, and resource theft at the United Nations. Congo declares independence in 1960, but Lumumba pays the ultimate price, assassinated for daring to envision a Congo controlled by its own people. His death becomes one of the greatest tragedies of African liberation. A continental wave that cannot be stopped by the mid-1960s, almost every African country had gained independence. Some through negotiation, some through relentless protest, some through war. But one truth becomes clear. Once the people stood up, the colonial empires fell. Africa did not wait for freedom. Africa forced the world to accept it. 1960, a year that changed the world forever, a year so powerful that historians today call it the Year of Africa. The scene opens with flags rising across the continent, one after another, like a sunrise sweeping from east to west. In just 12 months, 17 African countries finally broke free from colonial rule. No other year in modern history saw such a massive wave of independence. It wasn't just political change, it was a continental earthquake. After decades of forced labor, taxation, land dispossession, and foreign domination, African people began to reclaim their voice. The speeches were different. The celebrations were unlike anything the world had seen, from the Atlantic coast to the Sahara, from Central Africa to the Indian Ocean. Nations stood up and declared, "We are free." The year began with Cameroon and Togo, former trust territories under the United Nations, stepping into independence. Then came a dramatic acceleration. Spring and summer of 1960 turned into a revolution in slow motion. Ghana had already set the stage in 1957, but now its influence could be seen everywhere. Leaders quoting Kwame Nkrumah's words, liberation movements borrowing strategies, youth marching with hope written on their faces. And then came the big moment, Congo's independence on June 30th, 1960. The world watched as Patrice Lumumba delivered a bold speech stating that Congolese freedom was not a gift from Belgium. It was a victory earned through struggle, blood, and resilience. That speech became one of the defining moments of African liberation. By the end of the year, Mali, Madagascar, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, Mauritania, Nigeria, and Somalia had raised their new flags. For many of these nations, it was the first time in centuries that local people controlled their own destiny. 1960 also changed how the world looked at Africa. Before this year, Africa was treated as a passive continent, something to be divided, ruled, or exploited. But suddenly the map changed overnight. 17 new seats appeared at the United Nations. African voices for the first time began shaping global debates on human rights, development, the Cold War, and racial equality. The superpowers were shocked. Europe was forced to reevaluate its global role. The United States and the Soviet Union competed for influence, knowing Africa was now a major player in world politics. For the first time, African leaders were invited to global summits, diplomatic tables, and international negotiations. Not as subjects, but as equals. But 1960 was not only about politics, it was about dignity. Newspapers around the world wrote headlines like, "The African continent awakens," "A new chapter for humanity," "The end of empire." For ordinary Africans, independence meant something deeper than a flag or anthem. It meant recognition. It meant identity. It meant that future generations would grow up with their own languages, cultures, and governments. This wave of freedom also inspired liberation movements still under colonial rule. Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. The message was clear. Freedom is possible. 1960 was not just a year, it was a turning point in global history. A moment when Africa stood tall and the world began to shift. Why liberation was incomplete. Independence swept across Africa like a wildfire of hope. From Ghana to Senegal, from Nigeria to the Congo, new flags rose, new anthems played, and for the first time in centuries, millions of people felt the thrill of freedom. But behind the celebrations and speeches, a different reality was forming, one that would shape the next 60 years of African politics, economics, and sovereignty. Because the painful truth is this: Africa became politically independent, but not economically free. The colonizers left the house, but they took the keys with them. One, independence with strings attached. As the European empires retreated, they made sure the new African states remained tied to them through economic traps, political pressure, and military influence. These were not accidental outcomes. They were designed. A. Colonial taxes. The French pension system, Francophone Africa, was hit the hardest. Former French colonies were forced to continue paying colonial taxes, supposedly as reimbursement for the cost of being colonized. Yes, African countries were expected to pay France for the privilege of being exploited. Many states still use the CFA franc, a currency fully controlled by the French treasury. France holds a major portion of these nations' reserves. Contracts for mining, energy, and infrastructure went straight to French companies. On paper, the flags changed. In reality, the power structure barely moved. 1. Debt, the new chains after the old chains. The next wave of control came through finance. After independence, the IMF and the World Bank swept in, offering development loans. They came with smiling diplomats and promises of partnership. But hidden in the contracts were conditions that broke the backbone of African economies. Governments were forced to remove subsidies on food and fuel. Local industries were shut down because countries were told to open their markets. National assets, from railways to power stations, were privatized and sold to foreign companies. Currencies were devalued, making imports expensive and exports cheap. This created a revolving door of permanent debt, where African countries ended up paying more in interest than they originally borrowed. Independence became a flag, not freedom. 1. The mineral trap. Who really owns Africa's wealth? Colonialism never ended, it simply changed uniforms. African countries possess the world's richest mineral belts: gold, diamonds, oil, gas, copper, cobalt, uranium, bauxite, and more. But control of these resources did not shift to Africans after independence. Multinational corporations took over the mines. Western powers backed regimes that protected foreign interests. Local communities remained poor, while billions flowed overseas. The Congo alone contains minerals essential for smartphones, electric cars, and modern technology, yet the people of the Congo remain some of the poorest on Earth. This is not a coincidence. It is a strategy. 1. Puppet leaders and regime control. To maintain influence, Western powers supported leaders who were loyal and removed those who were not. They didn't need colonies. They only needed cooperative presidents. Installed leaders. Some African leaders served colonial interests more than their own people. They accepted aid, weapons, and political protection in exchange for granting mining rights or supporting foreign agendas. But the true enemies of the West were the African leaders who dreamed of real freedom. 1. Assassinating revolutionaries, the war against Pan-Africanism. Every African leader who tried to build a united, independent, economically free Africa was met with sabotage, coups, or assassination. Patrice Lumumba, Congo, 1961. Lumumba wanted true independence, control over Congo's minerals, an end to Belgian influence, and a united Africa. For that, he was removed from power, tortured, killed, and dissolved in acid. Declassified documents now show involvement from Belgium and the CIA. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, 1966. Nkrumah wanted a United States of Africa and pushed for an African currency. Before his dream took shape, he was overthrown in a coup widely linked to Western intelligence agencies. Ghana became independent, but the economic strings remained. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso, 1987. Sankara rejected loans, cut ties with France, empowered women, and nationalized resources. He was assassinated at age 37. The new government reversed almost everything he stood for. These were not just deaths of individuals. They were deaths of a vision, a truly free Africa. 1. The new colonialism, neo-colonial control, so even after independence. Foreign troops stayed on African soil. Foreign banks controlled African currencies. Foreign corporations owned African wealth. Foreign governments influenced African politics. Africa became free, but not sovereign. The world changed in 1960, but Africa did not fully break the chains. It simply traded visible chains for invisible ones, and the struggle for true liberation continues today. After the political wave of independence in the 1950s and 60s, African leaders quickly realized something important. Freedom alone was not enough. Unity was the real key to survival. The colonial borders remained, the economies were still weak, and every new African state was vulnerable to foreign influence. So in 1963, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, 32 independent African nations came together to create something historic, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. The mission was bold but necessary: end colonialism, protect newly independent states, and promote continental unity. For the first time, Africa had an official political body where nations could speak with one voice, and the OAU did achieve important victories. It became the backbone of liberation movements, supporting the struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Namibia. The OAU also played a major role in the global fight against apartheid, keeping pressure on South Africa until the system finally fell in 1994. In many ways, the OAU was the diplomatic shield of Africa during its most vulnerable decades, but the dream of deep unity faced heavy challenges. The OAU was built as a club of sovereign states, meaning each country protected its independence above all else. And that meant no unified African government, no African army to defend the continent collectively, no single African currency to strengthen economic power. Leaders like Nkrumah wanted the United States of Africa, but others feared losing national control. So the OAU became a powerful symbolically, but limited practically. By the early 2000s, Africa needed an institution that could do more than talk. It needed something that could act. This led to the birth of the African Union, AU, in 2002, an upgraded, modernized version of the OAU designed to fit the 21st century. Today, the AU is pushing new tools for real unity. AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, creating the world's largest free trade zone by population. The African Passport, a future goal to allow visa-free travel across the continent. Security and peacekeeping reforms, steps toward an Africa that can defend itself. The project is far from complete, but the direction is clear. Africa is slowly moving from political independence toward true continental integration, the unity its early leaders dreamed of. Independence may have lowered the colonial flags, but the battle for true freedom didn't end. Today, Africa faces a new kind of struggle, a battlefield without soldiers, without gunfire, and without formal declarations of war. This is the era of neo-colonialism, a system where control continues, but in modern, subtle, and often invisible ways. The first pressure comes from Western mining giants, many of which have been operating since the colonial era. They control gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, and rare earth minerals, resources that power smartphones, electric cars, and global industry. African soil produces the wealth, African workers extract it, but most of the profits leave the continent. This is not the empire with a flag, this is the empire with a logo. Second, Africa hosts foreign military bases, especially from the US, France, and other global powers. Publicly, they say it's to fight terrorism, but behind the scenes, these bases secure strategic interests, trade routes, minerals, and influence. Some African nations have more foreign soldiers than their own troops. It's security, yes, but at a cost, dependency. Third is the weight of debt traps. While nations celebrate political freedom, many remain financially handcuffed. Loans from global institutions come with conditions. Privatize this, cut that, reduce subsidies here, open markets there. These policies weaken local industries and force governments into cycles of borrowing and repayment. The chains are no longer made of iron, they are made of interest rates. Then comes the battle for the mind. Media propaganda. Global news networks shape the world's perception of Africa, often highlighting poverty, corruption, and conflict while ignoring innovation, success, and growth. When you control the story, you control the people. And for decades, Africa did not control its narrative. But here is the twist. A new force is rising. Africa's young population, the most youthful on Earth, is pushing back. Through technology, entrepreneurship, social media, and geopolitics, a new consciousness is emerging. African innovators are creating fintech apps, e-commerce empires, AI research hubs, and renewable energy solutions. Startups are challenging old systems. Young people are questioning governments, demanding accountability, and rejecting foreign manipulation. Geopolitically, Africa now negotiates with more partners, China, India, the Middle East, and BRICS nations, reducing Western dominance. Power is shifting. The new struggle is not just about independence from foreign control. It's about rebuilding Africa on Africa's terms. A generation is rising, and this time they know exactly what is at stake. Africa's journey to independence is one of the most dramatic political transformations in modern history. Within a few decades, entire nations broke free from the chains of colonial rule. Leaders rose, flags changed, the world map was rewritten. But here's the truth. Africa gained political independence, not economic independence. The colonial governments left, but the colonial system stayed, and that's why the story isn't over. The next chapter is still being written right now. Today, the continent faces a new liberation struggle, one that is less visible, less obvious, but far more powerful. It is not fought with guns or marches in the streets. It is fought in boardrooms, trading floors, tech hubs, and diplomatic negotiations. It is fought in African minds. It is fought in classrooms. It is fought on the internet. The next independence is about control, not control of land. Africa already has that, but control of the systems that shape the future. 1. Control of resources. Africa holds the minerals that power the world: cobalt, gold, oil, gas, and rare earths. But ownership of these resources is still largely in foreign hands. The next independence requires value addition. African companies, African refineries, African patents, and African wealth staying in Africa. 2. Control of information. For decades, the story of Africa has been told by others. The media shapes perceptions, and perceptions shape policy. The new struggle means Africans controlling their own narrative, building their own platforms, and defining their own identity. 3. Unity across borders. No African country, no matter how rich in diamonds, oil, or people, can win alone. The first wave of independence created 54 flags. The next wave must bring those flags together: a unified market, a shared currency, connected infrastructure, collective bargaining power on the global stage. 4. Ending foreign dependency. Every loan, every military base, every foreign mining contract is a reminder that independence is incomplete. The next liberation requires African innovation, African supply chains, and African solutions, not borrowed blueprints from outside. The truth is simple. Political freedom opened the door, but economic freedom is what will take Africa through it. And this time, the fight won't be led by presidents or liberation armies. It will be led by ordinary Africans, entrepreneurs, students, creators, activists, and innovators. The first independence changed Africa's flags. The next independence will change Africa's future. Support Africarized by checking out our official store. Wear African history with pride. Each purchase helps us create more powerful content for our continent. Hit subscribe, join our membership, and help us grow a Pan-African media platform that tells our stories the way they deserve to be told. Together, we rebuild the narrative.